stand at the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Let the desert wind scour your face, and you will likely feel the crushing weight of human ambition. For millennia, Western civilization has stared at these artificial mountains and seen the ultimate triumph of man over nature. We see the pharaohs as architects of eternity, men who commanded the very earth to rise toward the heavens. But this grand narrative is a magnificent, deliberate lie. The true story of Egypt is not a chronicle of humanity conquering the wild. It is the terrifying, claustrophobic tale of a species backed into a corner by a dying planet, desperately building monuments to convince themselves they were not entirely powerless. Before it was a sea of unforgiving sand, North Africa was a boundless, vibrant paradise. 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was a lush savanna, a sprawling canvas of massive freshwater lakes, wandering herds and nomadic tribes who moved freely beneath a forgiving sky. But the Earth is an indifferent host. A microscopic shift in the planet's orbital tilt stopped the monsoon rains. The green withered, the lakes turned to dust. A wall of encroaching sand began to swallow a continent, driving terrified, thirsty human beings eastward into a volatile, swampy trench. The Nile River Valley was not a chosen promised land. It was a golden cage. The people who fled there were climate refugees, trapped in a narrow ribbon of life surrounded by an ocean of death. If they stepped too far east or west, the desert would claim them. If the river failed to rise, they would starve. Out of this absolute existential terror, the modern state was born. This is the story of how human beings, cornered by a climate apocalypse, invented the God King, weaponized religion, and constructed the first superpower, only to realize that the immense wealth they created would inevitably summon their own destruction. To understand the mind of ancient Egypt, one must understand the psychology of the trapped. By 3300 BCE, the scattered tribes along the Nile realized that uncoordinated survival was impossible. The river was a chaotic deity, flooding too high and drowning villages, or rising too low and delivering famine. To tame the water, they needed total synchronization. This logistical nightmare required a unifying force, leading to the rise of the early power centers in the south. These early leaders recognized a fundamental truth of geopolitics. Decentralized power in a scarce environment is suicide. They needed to control the entirety of the river, from the rocky cataracts of the south to the sprawling, marshy delta in the north. This was not merely an expansionist desire. It was a structural necessity to monopolize the flow of grain and trade. The southern culture began to militarize, building fortresses where there had once been simple farms. The stage was set for the violent birth of the first nation-state, a blueprint of political unification that the modern world would unconsciously echo thousands of years later. The era of the fractured tribes was brought to a brutal end by Narmer, a warlord who understood that power is not just wielded, it must be performed. He is the bridge between chaotic survival and institutionalized dominance. The historical records do not depict a peaceful coalition under his rule. They show unification forged in uncompromising slaughter. By establishing a new capital at Memphis, the geographical choke point between the valley and the delta, Narmer effectively put a cork in the bottle. He controlled every ounce of grain and every human life that moved across the landscape. But military terror is a fragile instrument for enduring control. To govern a vast, trapped population, the state needed a revolution of the mind. Thus, the concept of Ma'at was engineered. Ma'at was the divine personification of cosmic balance, truth, and order. The pharaoh ceased to be a mortal dictator and was elevated to the living incarnation of the divine. The genius of this ideology lay in its psychological grip. The state convinced its citizens that without the pharaoh, the sun would freeze in the sky and the universe would collapse. Taxation was transformed from theft into a sacred ritual of survival. Centuries later, this divine machine found its ultimate expression in stone. Under Pharaoh Djoser, the brilliant visionary Imhotep transitioned Egyptian architecture from mud brick to monumental limestone. Imhotep's creation of the Step Pyramid was a declaration of war against time itself. The subsequent architectural leaps were not the work of broken slaves, but of a highly coordinated, well-fed national workforce. The state operated as a divine corporation, utilizing the world's first advanced tax system to predict harvests and manage surpluses. Yet, the pharaohs failed to see that by granting massive tax exemptions to the priesthoods to maintain their eternal cults, they were slowly bankrupting the very regime they sought to immortalize. No political ideology, no matter how divine, can survive an empty stomach. The illusion of the God King shattered when a global climate catastrophe struck. The rains failed worldwide. The Nile shrank to a muddy trickle for decades. The royal granaries, hollowed out by corruption and clerical greed, ran dry. When the pharaoh could no longer feed his people, his divinity evaporated. Egypt plunged into a horrific era of civil war. A total collapse of the centralized state where local governors hoarded power and survival became a localized, brutal affair. When stability was finally clawed back by southern leaders, the Egyptian mind had fundamentally altered. The infallible deity of the past was dead. The new era required a new justification for absolute power: the Shepherd King. The pharaoh was now depicted with weary eyes, a vigilant guardian holding a crook to protect his flock. Legitimacy shifted from mere divine blood right to the practical ability to provide. The state built massive hydraulic works, a desperate insurance policy against the river's betrayal. However, the search for economic security led to a fatal miscalculation. Egypt opened its eastern borders to migrants and merchants from the Levant to fuel a booming trade economy. These foreign settlers turned northern cities into cosmopolitan hubs. But as the central government weakened once more, the demographic shift became a geopolitical disaster. The migrants staged a subtle, devastating takeover. They brought a technological apocalypse to an isolated Egypt: the horse-drawn chariot and the composite bow. For the first time, the impenetrable borders of the Nile had failed. The Egyptians were utterly humiliated in their own homeland. Humiliation breeds radical transformation. The native Egyptians mastered the invaders' technology, drove them out, and pursued them fiercely into foreign lands. The trauma of the occupation fundamentally changed Egypt's grand strategy. The desert was no longer a protective shield. It was a highway for invasion. To prevent another conquest, Egypt decided it had to conquer the lands where the threats originated. The Shepherd King was replaced by the warrior pharaoh. The nation transformed into a permanent war machine, expanding its borders to unprecedented lengths and funneling staggering wealth back to the capital. Yet, this golden age of imperialism cultivated a fatal flaw within. The religious priesthoods became a state within a state, controlling vast swaths of land and rivaling the pharaoh's wealth. The counterstrike from the throne was the strangest revolution in ancient history. Pharaoh Akhenaten, recognizing the political threat of the priests, initiated a radical, top-down religious purge. He erased the old pantheon, elevated a single solar deity, and moved the capital to the barren desert. But this was less a spiritual awakening than a ruthless, desperate political centralization. While Akhenaten stared at the sun, the empire burned, losing crucial territories to rising foreign powers. Upon his death, the old order violently reasserted itself. Subsequent dynasties spent vast fortunes projecting a terrifying military facade. blinding themselves to the fact that the state was rotting from within. Heavily reliant on foreign mercenaries and crushed by a bloated bureaucracy, the final collapse of Egyptian supremacy was part of a Mediterranean-wide apocalypse, a perfect storm of drought, famine, and systemic failure that unleashed waves of migrating warriors known as the Sea Peoples. Egypt survived this onslaught through desperate defensive stands, but the effort broke the empire's back. International trade ceased. The treasury emptied. The centralized authority evaporated. From this point, the story of Egypt becomes a painful, centuries-long sunset. The fragmented nation was conquered sequentially by its southern neighbors and then brutally crushed by the iron war machines of Mesopotamian empires. The sack of their holiest cities was a trauma from which the native psyche never fully recovered. Egypt survived only by entering a deeply cynical, pragmatic phase. It hired foreign mercenaries to protect its borders and deliberately copied the artistic styles of its ancient, glorious past. It was a desperate nostalgia, wrapping a fragile state in the sacred, untouchable robes of history. But the geopolitical center of gravity had moved. Rising empires from the east and west swept in, turning the proud Nile into a mere breadbasket province, draining its wealth to fund foreign thrones. The final, tragic act belonged to Cleopatra VII. She attempted a breathtaking geopolitical gamble, aligning with the titans of Rome to leverage their military might and preserve Egypt's autonomy. But the game ended in absolute defeat. With her passing, the era of the pharaohs was extinguished. Egypt became the personal property of a Roman emperor, its ancient gods slowly silenced, its hieroglyphs forgotten, and the sovereign entity born thousands of years prior dissolved into the dust. Looking past the glittering gold and the colossal stones, we must understand the true civilizational mechanics of this ancient titan. Egypt is the ultimate historical case study in the paradox of geographical determinism. The ecological cage of the Nile forced unparalleled innovation, compelling a terrified population to invent administration, monumental architecture, and a cohesive national identity. However, the very elements that guaranteed its early dominance ensured its eventual subjugation. The sheer agricultural reliability of the Nile, once mastered, created a surplus of wealth so staggering that it became an irresistible magnet for the rest of the world. Egypt did not fall because it grew weak. It fell because the rest of the world grew hungry. It became too valuable to be left alone. Furthermore, the internal structures designed to maintain absolute order, the divine kingship, the rigid bureaucracy, the monumental allocation of resources to the dead, made the state incredibly brittle in the face of sudden external shocks. The profound conservatism that demanded the eternal preservation of the status quo stifled the very flexibility required to survive a rapidly globalizing world. As we navigate our own era of profound climate anxiety, shifting global empires, and the relentless pursuit of infinite economic growth, the shadow of the pharaohs stretches across the millennia to offer a chilling warning. We too are building our grand monuments, towers of glass and steel, empires of data and commerce, believing they will outlast the sands of time. But history is fiercely unsentimental. It teaches us that geography is destiny, that all borders eventually fail, and that the greatest threat to a civilization is often the illusion of its own permanence. The desert always waits, and sooner or later, the earth reclaims everything.